Welcome, everybody, back to the Segal Talks here at the Graduate Center, CUNY, the City University of New York in Manhattan. It's a start of another week of uncertainty and big discussions of opening and closing, of rising unemployment numbers we haven't seen since the Great Depression, over 30 or 33 million countries in Europe. They are carefully opening schools and businesses, and we see cases coming back. So we look out of our windows for weeks now, whereas the reality outside, and inside we have the uncertainty of our own existence. And all these weeks, if you have been listening before, we have been talking to theater artists from all around the globe, now over 30 artists from India, Pakistan, Egypt, Belgium, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, everywhere. And today we are back to one of the significant countries in Africa, South Africa, that has been so much of the mind of everybody who was on the side of social justice, of progressive justice, and the side of life. We feel that theater artists always have been on that right side. And especially if you look at South Africa, we had the great Basil Jones with us from Handspring. They were on the right side. And if people would have listened to them earlier, the country would have saved a lot of trouble. In South Africa is this theater that's also as significant and well known as the Boef du Nord, or the Schaubühne Berlin, or the Berlin Ensemble, or the Public Theater, Lincoln Center, Lemmy Piccolo, Milano, and so many others. There is the Great Market Theater, and with us is Ismail Mahomed, who is running it, who is a director of it, who has done many festivals. He is a part of the landscape of theater in Africa, especially, of course, in South Africa. And it's a time where we feel very strongly that we should listen to what theater artists have to say, what they are thinking about, and to take it really serious. As theater artists, if you're listening in as student or practitioners, or you write or you teach, this is of significance, but also for us, all of us who go to theater, who are interested in the arts, who look to theater to create meaning for life, where we come from, where we are going to. And of course, this is a moment of a global crisis, of a real crisis, unprecedented. Mankind has been shut down and being pushed on a big brake in a car that seems to flip over, and steering of the road. We don't know what will happen and how long this will be going on. If we are on top of the mountain, or just starting, or we are going down already, nobody knows. So Ismail, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Frank, and thank you to everyone who's watching. And thank you mostly for the world that stood with South Africa when we needed the world to stand with us during our fight for social justice and the fight against apartheid and the fight for a new democracy. So thank you very much. A lot of it was done through the arts, through the artistic community.
Thank you. Where are you right now, and what time is it?
It's now just past 6 in the evening. I'm in my home in Johannesburg. We're all under lockdown conditions. South Africa has 5 levels in terms of the lockdown. So we've just come out of level 5, which has been the most stringent lockdown. And we're now at level 4, which means that there are certain rigid conditions still attached to the lockdown. All our theaters still remain closed, but we're also in the next hour going to go into a curfew time where there may be no movement out of doors between 8 o'clock to 6 o'clock the next morning. So everything comes to a complete standstill, despite the fact that we may have some movement and limited number of companies operating during the daytime businesses, but theaters all remain closed.
For how long have you been in lockdown in Johannesburg?
The country's been in lockdowns from the end of March. So around the 26th of March, we went into lockdown. We've been at that level for at least, initially it was supposed to be for 3 weeks, and then extended for 2 further weeks. And as from the beginning of May, we've been at level 4, which means that some corporate companies can open under very rigid conditions. There's limited number of people at work. Everyone has to wear a face mask once they leave their home. They have to be gazetted by government as essential workers in order to be able to work. So yeah, we think we probably would be in this state for quite some time. You know, the numbers in South Africa only began to peak much later than it did in Europe and other parts of the world. And I think the initial response from our government to close down and shut down immediately so that hospitals could prepare the medical facilities and so forth, so that we would be able to flatten the curve much faster than most other countries across the globe. You know, the initial responses over the first 3 weeks was met with, I think, a great deal of support throughout the country. The last 2 weeks has been a little strenuous, with some people resisting it. But also there are other social problems attached to it, in that we're still a country with so many divides, social divides, that we've inherited from apartheid, but also the fact that over the last 10 years in particular, we've had poor political leadership and, you know, high levels of corruption in government, which meant that we still live with communities that are socially disparate, communities that have and communities that don't. So whilst it's easy in suburbs that such as the one that I live in, to be able to lock down and to stay in your home, it's incredibly difficult in the informal settlements and in townships where people live 12 people to a one-room shack. How do you socially distance in that place if people have such poor conditions and high levels of unemployment? You know, they're dependent on food parcels, and if those food parcels from the state are not delivered efficiently or adequately, you're bound to have people protesting, you're bound to have people wanting to go out, break the rules, to go and look for food for their families. And those are the challenges that the last 2 weeks of the lockdown has brought to the fore. But I think the very first 2 days of the lockdown has reawakened a consciousness in our country of just how much we still need to do in order to bring about equality and social justice in our country.
How does it materialize? How does the country know we have to do a lot? We are not there yet. Is it discussions between people on television or in family? How?
I think at the present moment, it's social media that has raised the consciousness of people to a large extent. As soon as we got down to lockdown, people began to depend on WhatsApp groups, on Facebook to a large extent, on Twitter for information. You know, print media has suffered to a large extent, and we've also just seen in the last week where at least one major publishing house has shut down a number of its publications. So to a large extent, people are depending on online information. And there is a risk to that as well, because you also get lots of fake news. So it does take some level of discerning as to how you draw out the information you want. But I think what is really exciting is that at this particular point, the country is really engaged, not just with the scare about the pandemic, but the reality of the country that we live in, the failures of our government in some extent, the successes that we have achieved as a country, and how we all need to work together. That looking after, wearing a mask is not just looking after yourself, it's also looking after the other person that you interact and engage with.
So where do you live in Johannesburg? When have you been out last time? Tell us, when you go out of your house, what do you see?
Well, I've been out of my house about a week ago, but that was largely to go out for shopping for essentials that I needed. It was about an hour out of the house. It really was quite strange, because the area in which I live in which is Rosebank, in Melrose in Johannesburg, is quite a busy area. I've got to traverse or cross over a very busy street. The fast rail track is about a 5 minutes walk from my house. That's all deserted. The streets are deserted. People are allowed to go out in the mornings between 6 to 9 o'clock for recreational walks or for jogging. But anything after that, everything becomes very, very quiet. The shopping malls are quiet. The streets are deserted. You can hear an eerie silence wherever you go.
such a big change of what we perceive as a reality and what we thought is what our way of life is. It and it's changed so fast. How do you feel? How do you feel as a person, as Ismail? What are you thinking about?
Well, I think, you know, working in a theatre space means that you're constantly in the presence of people. We work in a space where we touch people, where we connect with people, both physically and emotionally and intellectually, and not being able to be in the space with anyone else. You're just confined in your room. And though you're able to engage with people electronically, telephonically, by WhatsApp, by Zoom meetings, through other forms of technology, what we really lose is the human touch, the human contact. And I think, you know, in South Africa, particularly where the philosophy of Ubuntu, the caring for the other.
Ubuntu, say again?
Ubuntu.
Ubuntu.
Ubuntu, which is about the basic humanity that we all have of being able to share not just our ideas, but also our space with other people is somewhat compromised by this lockdown. So, you know, it does take a serious impact on the way of we live, but definitely on our mindsets. It does impact on you emotionally. It does drain you in you know, just knowing that you don't have the real physical contact that defines you as a human being.
Yeah. So how do you spend your day?
Well, you know, I am working from home. The management team of the Market Theatres all working from home, you know, by emails, by telephone calls and so forth. So a significant part of my day, at least the morning part, is about doing work for the Market Theatre Foundation. I spend a lot of time in the afternoons in dialogue with artists and you know, cultural workers from other parts of the globe, engaging in a similar dialogue as the one that you and I are having today. And I think for me that is particularly important because as a country that came out of international isolation in 1992, just before we got into a new democracy, you know, we had the cultural boycott against South Africa. So we had really, whilst we had allies that fought against apartheid, culturally we were isolated. And in post-94, we established a large number of international contacts, collaborations, partnerships, exchanges. And I'm particularly interested in the power of the arts to unite us as a world community. So for me, at this particular time, where physical exchanges between artists and arts administrators is not possible to take place, I think it's crucially important that as an artistic community across the globe, that we still engage with each other, because we don't know for how long we are going to be separated physically. And that at least the engagement that we have with each other in this way means that we can still share ideas, we can still continue to address the issues of the globe through the arts in different dynamic ways, and that we support each other through this pandemic, and that when we're out of this pandemic, we're not starting the process of discovery. We are at least holding hands, if not physically, metaphorically, we are.
Mm-hmm. You say you're in contact with artists and cultural workers in South Africa. How is the mood? What's on people's mind?
Well, I think, you know, the first part of the lockdown left people despondent in the arts sector. It was a loss of jobs. It was a loss of the sacred space in which you work in which you assemble the theatres, and that it's not just about losing contact with each other as artists, it's losing contact with audiences and the inability to be able to dialogue with our audiences in the way that we do through storytelling, through the creation of our work, through absorbing the atmosphere and the emotions of our audiences in our theatres. But I think, you know, as we moved into the second week, and particularly in South Africa, where economics plays a very important part in the lives of artists, because whilst theatres may be supported by the state, that support is largely for infrastructure and for operations. It does not support artistic content, and it does not support artists.
So
And
you
for
mean
that,
you have to raise money for artists through ticket sales or
yes, through ticket sales, through corporate
foundations?
sponsorship, through foundations, through public philanthropy, we raise money for programs. So, given the fact that artists don't have secure jobs, means that levels of despondency intensified, but there's also a desperation with some artists to want to do some things online, hoping that in some way or the other they would be able to monetize what they're doing, knowing full well that what they're doing is not theater. It's online work, it's partly film, it may be a hybrid genre of work that we're beginning to invent at this particular time as a mode for survival, so that we're able to at least earn some kind of money as artists. As the Market Theatre Foundation, we did commission artists in the initial phases to be able to do some kind of work, whether that was putting on pieces of monologues on television, on online platforms. But that was in the first 10 days of the lockdown, where everyone needed to reconfigure what we were doing. But we full well knew that that will never ever take the place of live theatre. But what we've encouraged over the last 4 to 5 weeks is funding artists to take part in these kind of discussions with fellow artists from across the country and also the globe. And we've had a wonderful collaboration with artists in Sweden, facilitated through ourselves and the Embassy of Sweden and a community-based organization called Hear My Voice in South Africa, where we've had a weekly series of dialogues between artists with some performances interspersed in there. And that's created a great sense of unity amongst the community, but also one of support for them to be able to feed each other, both in terms of inspiration, but just emotionally. And I think right now in South Africa, where we're also grappling with the fact that although the government has announced relief efforts for sectors that are affected by the lockdown, economic sectors, the arts community has been waiting for almost 6 to 7 weeks for some sort of relief from government. And that's taken a long while. It's still in process. It's not forthcoming as fast as artists thought it would be forthcoming. And this does create levels of disillusionment with the state, and particularly with, to some extent, the Ministry of Arts and Culture. I think if one talks of the concept of relief, then one has to work with a sense of emergency. If one's taking 6 to 7 weeks to begin to respond to relief calls, then I think one doesn't understand the concept of emergency, but neither does one understand the concept of poverty.
Yeah, I think also in New York, and up to 8, 9, 10 months, everything has been canceled. Artists are out of work. I met musicians also, but so many people who are used to work on as freelance on so many productions also enjoyed that kind of life, that kind of with all the complications, but it's something very vibrant about it. And this has come to a full stop. And of course, there's no health insurance. I don't know, is there health insurance for artists in South Africa?
No, unfortunately not. The arts is not very regulated in South Africa. So there's very little legislation to support artistic communities. There's hardly strong unions in the creative sector. So these are all problems that add to the challenges. We also deal with the fact that when we came out of apartheid, we didn't have a very structured and effective Ministry of Arts and Culture that serviced the entire country and all its populations. One needed to be structured. But we've also had fundamental flaws with the way that government has deployed ministers to that particular department. We know for a fact that in the 6 administrations that we've had so far, that very often ministers that have been deployed to the Department of Arts and Culture have really had no passion, no understanding, real understanding of the creative sector. And hence we've had lots and lots of problems with being able to uh, devise policies that aid and support the creative economy and the artists in particular.
Yeah, it's a devastating effect that apartheid had during apartheid, but also, of course, in the long term, what we still suffer from, most probably also for decades. Laurent Clavel from the French Culture Service in New York, who also said, you have to talk to Ismail Mahomed, you know, and then of course you were on our list also, but he said, you know, about your work. Tell us, why is the Market Theatre special in Johannesburg? And what makes it different? And is something changing at the moment? Is thinking what you do, is the needle moving?
Yeah, before the Market Theatre Foundation was started as an independent theatre in 1976, just 2 days after the historic Soweto uprising that took place on June 16, 1976, when the government, the nationalist government, opened gunfire on students in the townships that were protesting against the Afrikaans medium language, Afrikaans language being the medium of education in the country, but essentially it was a great resistance against apartheid driven by young people. And 2 days after that historic event, the Market Theatre opened as a non-racial theatre in what was formerly an Indian fruit and vegetable market in the heart of Johannesburg. Now, at multiple levels, that is very significant for me, particularly because my grandfather was a fruit and vegetable trader. My father was a regular traveler from Forces, which is miles and miles and miles away from Johannesburg, to come to Johannesburg to transport fruit and vegetable, take it back into the old town of Forces, which is miles and miles away. And yeah, I come back, you know, so many decades later in that very same building, not as the fruit and vegetable trader that my grandfather and my father were, but as the CEO of this particular institution, where we no longer trade in fruit and vegetables, but we trade in creativity, we trade in ideas, we trade in language, we trade in debate, we trade in expression. But given that the Market Theatre, when it opened at the time in 1976, there were 4 state institutions in South Africa, one in the city of Cape Town, one in Johannesburg, one not in Pretoria, which is the diplomatic city, one in Durban, and one in the Free State, which is largely Afrikaans. And those theatres were only open to white people. So black people had no access to formal theatres that was supported by the state in any particular way. Despite that, there was a culture of theatre that prevailed in black communities. As an Indian person, I was in a much more complex situation, even though I'm a 5th generation South African. You know, my forefathers were from India. I'm 5th generation. And in the segregated communities that we lived in South Africa, as an Indian person, I had no arts education in school, which was what happened with the majority of black people in South Africa. But I also suffered a further disadvantage in the sense that I grew up in what was a traditional Indian and a traditional Muslim community, where theater, music, dance was not encouraged culturally. So I became exposed to the arts quite later in my life. And I think it was in my final year of schooling, of high schooling, when Soweto had literally gone up in flames. And that was in 1976 during the Soweto uprising. And we lived on the opposite side of the railway track to Soweto. And we could see the flames going up. We could see the police going up there. That in some way awakened a consciousness. But in the 80s, when the country went through an enormous amount of repression and censorship, it was through the arts, through our theater, through our music, through our dance, that we informed our communities about what was happening in our country.
Tell us a bit about it. What did you see? What did you do? What did you see first was inspired you? And what did you feel? What worked that helped to change? Looking to America, where we also feel things have to change. They cannot stay the way they are, and they will not, but they should be in a good state. What role can art play in theater? What worked?
Well, I think for us as a community that was on the outside of the apartheid fence, you know, we found community through expression. That what our artists were presenting on stage was our fears, was our hopes. They were telling our stories. They were telling the dreams of what a free South Africa could be. And I think with that resonated so very, very strongly amongst us. And it's in that time that some of the most wonderful plays, such as Warza Albert, some of Athol Fugard's work, which speaks to that particular period of pain, of dehumanization, really connected South Africa with the world and telling our stories beyond the world, but in some ways also allowing people to come into our theaters to be able to find information, to find healing. And post 1994, you know, whilst our theater itself, the Market Theater, attained a reputation as the home of protest theater, South African protest theater, because of the work that we did from 1976 right up to 1994. In 1994, suddenly Nelson Mandela arrived and gave us this whole new country. The word reconciliation was on every single person's lips in South Africa. It was about reaching out. It was about forgiveness. How do you suddenly come out of your space of protest to suddenly move into a theater space and talk reconciliation, talk healing, talk unity, talk Ubuntu in some way? But we managed to be able to do this as theater workers. We found purpose in being able to tell new stories. We created those stories. Suddenly the world opened to us. The international cultural boycott fell away. We were able to engage with artists from across the globe that were connecting with South Africa and South Africa connecting with them. But you know, we didn't get stuck in that romanticization of reconciliation. We dealt with some of the difficult questions of, you know, just what do you need as a society to reconcile with? What is it that you're going to reconcile with? The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that was a political platform, really was theater in itself as well. And a lot of what was presented in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission also found its way into our theaters with artists telling those same stories. And I think we found a great deal of healing through that. But then we got into the period of HIV and AIDS, and we found that theater to a large extent played a vital role in addressing the issues of HIV, AIDS, and in terms of creating awareness, in terms of creating support, in terms of creating healing, but also in terms of creating protest. Because we do know that our president at that time, Thabo Mbeki, was very much an AIDS denialist.
He denied it, yes.
Denied it, yes. So, you know, theater, I think in that particular period, theater once again found its political voice of protest. And that was a wonderful shift to come suddenly from Mandela's protest, you know, a period of reconciliation, healing, loving, reaching out, unity, to suddenly find we're protesting. And this time we were not protesting against each other. We're not protesting about race. We were protesting around a state, around a president that was not sensitive to the HIV/AIDS issues. We've since then dealt with issues of climate. We've dealt with issues of class. We've dealt with issues of identity in different ways. And I think particularly over the last number of years, we've seen young people in particular dealing with issues of decolonization of ideas, decolonization of identity and so forth. And, you know, we've also come to this particular period, particularly over the last 10 years during President Zuma's reign, where we knew, given his own reputation as a philanderer, that gender violence and gender insensitivity, you know, became so high and rife in our country that once again artists needed to make their voices heard, whether that was through song, through music, through poetry, through dance, to speak out against gender violence, to speak about, equality amongst gender, to address the issue of the body politics and so forth, sexuality, gender, all the related political issues associated with that. And I think we've suddenly, when the COVID-19 pandemic hit us, what do? We don't go into silence as artists. We're seeing our artists writing poetry, a novel of short stories, an anthology of short stories was compiled within the first 2 weeks and published in the third week. We're seeing artists constantly reconfiguring the space and asking, how are we going to talk about the issues related with this particular pandemic? Not just what it means for our economy and so forth, but what has it meant for us personally? And I think that in the time that when we have to get back into our theaters, we are going to have lots and lots of stories to tell. Stories about isolation. We've told stories of isolation in the past. We told stories of Ruth First. We've told stories of Jeremy Cronin, of Nelson Mandela, of all the people that were in detention under apartheid. This time around, it's not just the leaders that are in detention or in isolation, but it's every single one of us. How do we use this opportunity for that kind of reflection, for that kind of deeper delving into our inner humanity? How do we cope with isolation? And I think in the time that we're going to come back into theaters, for me, it's not going to be just about the pandemic has ended. You're given the instruction to reopen and bring back your audiences. I think the first, at least the month immediately after the lockdown period, is going to be a time for us as theater workers to deal with ourselves, to engage with each other. How do you deal with a colleague who may have lost a family member? How do you deal with an actor who's lost a lover in this pandemic? We're going to have to support each other. We're going to have to deal with our emotions, because in the telling of our stories to our audiences, we need to be comfortable carriers of our own emotions. And
how
that
do
for
you,
me is...
How do you deal with isolation? How do you do that? You said you haven't been out for a week and maybe goes once a week. So how do you do it yourself?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I live in a very networked community that even though I'm not seeing people physically, I'm engaging with people telephonically through Facebook, through other forms of communication. That for me is a way of remaining connected with people. But I also have made sure that in this particular period of the lockdown, that I do find myself a therapist. Somebody that I at least once a week can talk to, because I don't just carry my own emotions, I carry the emotions and the fears and the concerns of our entire institution, the people in it, but also their families, because there are realities of families wondering if this is to be extended, are people going to lose their jobs? We're talking about coming back into our theaters, where government last week issued a gazette to legislate state-funded theaters to open their stages for artists who want to come and do recordings for online work. But there are real questions to be asked about that. If you going to bring artists in that space to do online work, one is we ask the constant questions of, how are we faking theater? And knowing that is really not what we really do in our theater spaces, but we're making it happen. How are we coming to terms with what is our deeper understanding of the arts and what we're doing as just to survive? But there are real issues of constant fear, people walking in, who's been tested, who's not been tested. What happens if somebody arrives at a rehearsal and they suddenly don't have the right temperatures to be allowed into the space? How does that disrupt your space? I think for me, it's grappling with all of those logistical questions. As the CEO of our institution, bottom line is that the welfare of every single member of our team, which is about 60 staff members, rests on my shoulders. And I can simply open the doors tomorrow because government says we need to open, or I can simply say, stop government, you're not using your senses in this particular case. We need to provide support for artists in other ways at this particular time.
You know, I can only imagine how that must be feeling to go personally through, but also as an artist, but also responsible for a theater like the market, because whatever you do has a symbolic value, is a significant one. That's why theater is so important. It represents a model for something, and we have to be honest. We have to look for the truth and present it in all its varieties, the imagination, or a truth of imagination. And Oscar Eustace, who we also had on, who runs the Public Theater in New York, he himself had earlier in March the COVID. He was for 4 or 5 days in a hospital. He said one night he spent in the hallways in a Brooklyn hospital looking at the ceiling and thinking, what's going to happen to him? What's going to happen to his theater, to his family? 170 people.
Yep. Well, for an institution such as ours, which is so deeply connected to the issues of social justice, you know, we cannot just not take a position on the current crisis. We cannot just respond as business people in theatre. I think as anyone who is the CEO of the Market Theatre would fail if they did not balance the business interests with the deeper social interests of our society. And for me, that is crucial to celebrating the legacy of our institution. But it also keeps us anchored to our present time. And I think we constantly have to re-envision what we're going to do in our theatres. How are we going to survive? You know, this could continue for at least the next 7 or 8 months. Indications in South Africa are that we will only reopen our theatre spaces when the country gets to level 1. And that could be at least in another 7 or 8 months. Now, when you deal with a creative economy where artists depend extensively on freelance work and all that work is cancelled and artists have absolutely no income, we're dealing with a massive crisis of artists who are going to be struck by poverty, whose lives is never, ever going to be the same. Because one, it's going to affect them financially. There may be losses of homes, there may be losses of cars. You know, they may have to take their kids out of private schools and put them into state schools. There's, you know, so many other things that you deal with. And what do we do to support artists at this particular time? I think there's a need for arts managers, not just in South Africa. There's a need for arts managers in particular to speak about the crisis of poverty that we're going to have in the arts sector, and that how that crisis of poverty is going to affect the artistic community emotionally, and how that will need to be addressed post the pandemic, but how we need to create a space for the dealing of that trauma in our theatre spaces. But what we need to do as managers is proactively think about how we're going to re-engineer our theatres so that they become financially sustainable for the artists post this particular period. But in this particular period, we need to be activists whose voices need to be heard, that the state has to do more than what it's doing at the present moment to support a sector that is so vulnerable and fragile, but is different to any other sector in that we are a sector that is closely rooted to the identity of our nation, to the pulse of our nation. It's our poetry, it's our music, it's our voice that shapes the currency of our nation. Yeah, we agree. At the Segal Center, we often say that access to healthcare, access to education, and access to the arts are basic human rights. This is why we pay taxes. This is why we live in communities together. And it has to be organized in a way that's sustainable, but that also supports everybody, the healthcare workers, the educators, but also the artists. And this is what makes, as we now see, what makes life is exactly that, what we don't have at the moment. And so we need to find ways to do it sustainably. Oh, exactly. exactly. I agree with you on that.
Did you find when you moved from apartheid to reconciliation, from reconciliation to the AIDS crisis, and then going on, did you invent new forms of theater? Our motto is a little bit taken from Brecht, who said, "New times need new forms of theater." Did you make inventions? Did something change in those periods? And do you think there will be again something really change?
Oh, I think the landscape of theatre in South Africa has changed significantly from where we were in 1976 to where we are now in 2020. Our theatre still remains incredibly vibrant. It does also mean that more people have access to theatre, both as artists and as audiences. There are more festivals in our country, where artists can take their work and present their work and so forth. The content has changed significantly from what it was, but also the global interaction that we've had with after the lifting of the international cultural boycott has impacted on our theatre. I think there was a real curve that we saw in what I would call the kind of business of theatre. That in the 80s, where theatre was incredibly dynamic and powerful, and I think the best South African theatre works were created in that particular period of the 80s during the state of emergency, the repressive years of censorship, where artists were defiant and stood up, and whether that was in music, poetry, or whatever, which was original South African work that had a great deal of power, but much of that power speaks to our time now as well. Post the first democratic election in 1994, theatres did suffer with box office income, particularly the smaller theatres, because suddenly the cultural boycott had ended, and where people had not seen the big West End and Broadway musicals, but heard about it through people that had traveled, and we've read about it in newspapers and so forth. Suddenly, we had an influx of major musical theatre in South Africa, all the big name Broadway productions and the big West End productions, and where people previously spend less than $7 to $8 or on a theatre production, you now were paying so much more, 5 or 6 times more, to go to the theatre to see a big musical production, which meant that you could go to theatre less in a month because you needed to save all your money to go and see those big musical theatre productions. And I think that lasted for a few years. And then people realized that, those musicals are fun, they're great, they allow us escapism, but they really don't connect with us deeply in terms of offering us the kind of inspiration and the challenge that we want. I think something is very significant about South African audiences to the large extent, is that they don't want to go to the theatre just to watch a show, to be quiet and to applause at the end, and then to walk out and have dinner. Our audiences want to engage in dialogue. And there's something very unique about audiences in South African theatre, and particularly where there are significant Black audiences, that the audiences are not passive. You could sit through a performance and you could hear a murmur. You could see somebody in the audience respond, whether they would go clicking their fingers, whether they agree like that, or whether they would say, aha, or no. You would hear that in our audiences in theatre, which is very, very, very different to the Western experience of theatre, where everyone sits silent, pin drop silence, and you only respond when you're prompted by an actor on the stage to respond. It's very different in our theatres, and I think all of that has in some way shaped the way we make theatre. We take our audiences very seriously. We know our audiences want to be challenged. We know our audiences want to go out of the theatre and they want to engage in a dialogue. And very often that dialogue has happened in the foyers of theatres. It happened at dinner conversations, but now it also happens on social media. And I think the experimentation that we're doing in this particular time of COVID-19, where there's so much online work, and particularly even in a dialogue like this here, means that when we go back into our theatre spaces, it doesn't have to be a case of this or that. We can have a theatre production and we can continue to have the dialogue online for as long as that dialogue can continue and be sustained by the needs of a community that wants to talk.
Mhm. That's true. Richard Schechner, who was on our program next to this thing, said, he said every event should be online, every theater, even if people pay for it. But he also said at every event, perhaps there should be discussions afterwards, every evening. You know, people should sit, someone should talk. So it's all about community.
Yeah.
So at the moment, you say, this is interesting, as a reaction, you say we bring our artists in dialogue with international artists as in conversations. Is that's what you are doing and you pay the artists for this, or
Yes,
you pay someone in South Africa to talk to someone in Sweden, an artist?
Yes, we've paid every artist that has participated in our online programs to date. It's not a large fee. In South African terms, it's 1,000 rands to 2,000 rands that we've paid them. Our currency rate, exchange rate at the present moment is, I think, about 15 rands to $1 or something to that extent. But for artists at this particular time, we're trying to find creative ways of engaging them, of supporting them, but more than that, of keeping our audiences connected with us. I'm a firm believer that if we don't remain connected with our audiences for the next 7 months, audiences, in the same way as artists who are going to be changed and affected by this crisis, our audiences are also going to be changed and affected. If they're finding new hobbies now, if they're finding new ways for recreation, they're finding new ways to find information and be stimulated, they may retain those ways 7 months down the line. And if we are not part of their lives now, in this 7-month period, we might lose them forever, or we may struggle to bring them back. So for us, it's about, yes, we're paying our artists because we want to support our artists. We're having the dialogue because we believe the dialogue is necessary, but we also believe that it's a powerful way to remain connected with our audiences, who really are the people for whom we make theater.
Many talks we had with artists, whether it's Milo Rao or the Ostermeyer or many others, say it's also perhaps the time to go outside the space of the theater, the black box. So to really do the performances, not just on the streets, but also go to whatever, factories, halls, to have people's homes. Have you done that before? Are you planning this also to say, perhaps, as we now talk to each other, we don't need a space? If your government says record the performance, it doesn't even have to be in the theater. So theater is about the community. But are you having thoughts of, in case you reopen, of say, we're going to do this or that? Will it be just plays, or not? Will it be plays, or will there be forms on on site specific work or off site work, as Bertie Friedman says?
Yeah, well, one of the most dynamic units within the Market Theatre Foundation is the Market Theatre Laboratory, which started off 30 years ago as a school, particularly for young Black people who could not have access to formal theatre education. A vision of by the vision of a founding director, Barney Simon, and lead actor John Carney, who is now presently the ambassador, special ambassador at the Market Theatre, who founded the school. But with over the last 30 years, the school has also evolved, and particularly in the last 4 years, with a new director that we've appointed to the school, where we've played more on the word laboratory. Yes, education is core to our business, but laboratory is also core. The process of experimentation, the process of taking risks, the process of going out of the box and doing.
So what do you do? How do those productions look? What are the experiments?
Well, some of the experiments, at least one critically important experiment was for us that took place last year, long before COVID-19 became part of our lexicon. We did a production that took place simultaneously in Sao Paulo, New York, London, and Johannesburg, with performances interspersed with online work, digital work, live streamed work. A unique production in some ways, because South Africans worked with people from Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo worked with people from London and New York, and 4 writers were able to work together to come up with a script together, 4 directors in each city, and then 1 director mixing and merging live performance with online performance simultaneously, and so forth. We've used outside spaces around our theatre in the streets, at the taxi ranks to be able to do some work.
At the
We
taxi
also run,
ranks? What's that?
oh yes.
Where the taxis are waiting? No.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yep.
To be able to create some work for them. We've taken work into shopping malls, and we've presented work in the shopping malls. We've taken work to schools, to libraries. Just before COVID-19 and the lockdown, we were in the process of doing a production that was going to tour into various communities and take place not only in formal settings and in school halls and theatres, but in quite informal settings as well. So I think there is the need in our institution, although we were founded in what is a historic building at a very historic time, and one that we're incredibly proud of. We firmly believe that we don't have to be locked on the 3 or 4 stages that make up our theatre. The world is our stage. Wherever there's an audience, we have a story to tell. Wherever there's space, we can perform. But we also work very closely across different mediums. We also run a photography school. So there's been a great deal of storytelling collaboration between our photo workshop students and students in the theatre laboratory around the work that they create. And we have a center that's right in the heart of Johannesburg, in what is considered to be one of the most dangerous parts of Johannesburg, Hillbrow, and yet we have a vibrant arts center there that attracts people to engage in dialogue around issues of African identity, Pan-Africanism, to do drumming, to have African cuisine together with performance, to just play around. So for us, theatre is not a box. Theatre is not a format that's prescribed. Theatre is not about prescribed people. It's an open platform with no rules, and it's a place of real experimentation. Mm-hmm. It's a place where we allow everything about us as human beings to explode beyond the convention.
Mm-hmm. As a young man, when you said you came, from the families of merchants in a way, and what did you see, and what made you become a worker in the field of the arts and theater? What was that exactly? What inspired you?
Although I began to see some theater in my late teens, just close to when I was reaching about 20, I was exposed to theater for the very first time. I began, and that was political theater. It was the Black Theatre Workers Festival that took place in Indonesia, which was the Indian suburb in terms of the Group Areas Act, where we were relocated to. But it was really in my 4 years later, when I was a teacher at a school. I was a mathematics teacher. Mm-hmm. And during my tenure as a teacher, I ended up taking students almost every fortnight to the Market Theatre in Johannesburg. And I loved engaging with my students. One of our leading directors, who at one stage was also the artistic director of the Market Theatre, Malcolm Perkey, produced a play, Sophiatown, which dealt with the destruction of a non-racial suburb, and the onset of the Group Areas Act, and the onset of apartheid in South Africa. And that human story connected with so many of us. It took place in Sophiatown, which was the place where I was born. So of course there was a definite connection with the story, but that resonated with so many of the young people that I took to the theatre, because their parents were able to then tell them that story. And in that particular way, I began to get so much more drawn into theatre that in my 5th year of teaching as a mathematics teacher, I took students to the National Arts Festival in Grahamstown, South Africa, which is our leading major festival in South Africa at the time. And on the 10th day of that festival, which is the last day, one of the students said to me, I may forget everything I've learned in mathematics, science, and geography, but I will not forget what I've seen on stages, what I've learned from audiences, what I've learned at this arts festival. And that for me was deeply profound. It was the one factor that made me walk back to the school at the beginning of the new term, tender my resignation as a mathematics teacher, and go full-time into theatre, because I understood just what the power of theatre was for young people and how much young people in our country needed theatre to be able to transform our country, to be able to transform our lives, and to be able to transform everything around us. And I have no regrets about that particular decision I've made from leaving mathematics as a school teacher, which I loved. I enjoy being in a classroom space, and I'm grateful that I still have the opportunity from time to time to go into a classroom space to engage with students. But the power of theatre is far greater than the power of a formal school classroom.
Well, what do you think theater and performance demands of us now, of artists, also you, but in general, what is different now? What do you think is now of real importance?
Well, I think as artists, you know, our audiences are exposed to so much more. They're exposed to so much more technology. They're exposed to so much more opportunities. And they're exposed to so much more information. So as artists, we need to be constantly evolving as well. We need to be learning new technical skills. We need to be finding new ways of telling stories and creating those stories. We need to be reservoirs of information, but we also need to find ways of how we process that particular information so that we're able to communicate that information. I think as artists, we're more than just bearers of information. We are canaries in the mine. We predict what the change is going to be. We predict what the danger is ahead of us, and we imagine that. And we allow others to imagine that as well, so that they, in the present time, they're able to shape their future.
Yeah. So, So do you also teach artists? Do you have young directors, playwrights, writer at the Market Theatre? Do you have a theatre school?
Yes, we have a theatre school, the Market Theatre Laboratory. It's a 30-year-old school. We run a two-year full-time program for people, and a lot of the students that come to us are still drawn from historically marginalized communities. So whether they can afford the fees or not, we do take them, but we do take them on a very strict, rigid audition, because we do know how complex and how difficult this industry is and how competitive it is, so that we want to make sure that the 20 students that we graduate per year are students that can be absorbed into the arts sector and the creative economy, and they are. But with that, we also run a residency company for young actors, where we engage 6 to 7 actors on a year-long contract, and they could come out from any of the last 5 years of our school, but we do reserve at least 2 slots on that company for any graduates or young person that may come from any other institution or any other country, so that we know that the company is not just regurgitating the methodology and the techniques and the processes that they've learned, but that they constantly are being fed with new techniques and being challenged by people who come from the outside as well. That particular company was launched 2 years ago as a residency company, fully funded privately by our own efforts through fundraising from philanthropists. And we're incredibly grateful to the French Institute of South Africa, who has supported the company over the last 2 years. You know, artistically, the company has done incredibly well in terms of winning local South African awards. The company was scheduled to travel to Germany this year and to Japan. And unfortunately, both those international tours have been cancelled, or rather been postponed to next year. Of course, you know, those cancellations or postponements have been quite traumatic for the young artists, because these are artists who come from really deprived communities, historically marginalized communities, find opportunity, training, and suddenly get invitations to see the world. And COVID-19 has shut the barriers on that particular world for them. But you know, we've been able to engage with those artists in that company, keep their spirits high, and hopefully that once we pass this phase, and I'm quite sure that this phase will pass too, that the company will be able to tour internationally, and we're working very hard in doing that. And this is one of the reasons why I believe it's important for me as a theatre manager to remain engaged with our partners across the border, across the globe as well, so that we don't lose contact with each other. because international exchange is dynamic. It's far more effective than the political diplomacy that ambassadors and politicians can do at a round table. As arts people, when we travel the globe, we don't only connect with artists on the other side, we connect with their audiences. We stimulate audiences to get into a dialogue around internationalization. And I think particularly at this time, we've seen just before COVID-19, where significant parts of the world was becoming so nationalistic and so insular and closed, that we need the power of theater to break into those spaces and to talk around why internationalization and international exchange and international collaboration and international dialogue is so important for us, because more than just nations, we are a global community.
Yeah, that is important, and you are part of that, and you also help to form it. We are coming to the end of our hour. Is there something you could say to our listeners? You know, how to use that time now? Is where the times when we are in our homes, when you're listening,
Well,
of course, to
I
you.
think the most,
What is of significance?
I think the most significant thing for me at the moment is that we must not be stuck in our despondency. COVID-19 will come, it will pass. We've seen, not we've lived through, but we know historically that there have been several pandemics around on this planet. We've seen communities close, we've seen theater survive even through those pandemics. Theater will survive, it will rise, it will reopen. But for now, our crucial thing is support those that work in it and support the artists the most. Because if they're hampered by poverty, it's going to hamper their lives, it's going to hamper their emotions, it's going to hamper them intellectually, it's going to hamper core to what makes good theater, inspiration. A man cannot live without food. Artists need love, they need inspiration, but most of all, they need food. And at this particular time, we need to make sure that the global community, that foundations around the globe, that us as managements find ways of supporting artists so that they're able to pay their bills and not fear of what the darkness that lies ahead.
Mm-hmm. So that the artists who support us in our lives and give meaning and anticipate the future, and that now it's time to support them. That's a very important message. Thank you so much for taking a time with us, as it was important to hear from Johannesburg and from the Market Theatre what's on your mind, how you see all of this. This was beautiful statements and significant ones, and also looking from the perspective of a country that went through so many changes, had so many challenges, and in a way, also as Basil Jung said, somehow the government is doing okay. You know, this, we don't hear that often from our artists around the world. It's actually quite unlike. It's only South Korea or Taiwan where we heard similar stories. As in South Africa, it's surprising, especially given the big catastrophe we are experiencing here in the United States. It's shocking that it has not been handled in a way that it has been handled perhaps better in others. So if you have time for tomorrow and the days after to tune in, we have Natalia Vorosbit from the Ukraine, also a country, you know, that is going through an incredible, difficult time. We will hear from Palestine, Nizar Zouabi and Fida Zaidan, director, writer, and an actress. They will tell us about the situation in Palestine. Roberta Destrella Dalva and Dion Carlas will talk from Brazil to us and tell us about these situations that must be so very, very difficult from what we hear, what is happening with also a president that doesn't seem to listen, that doesn't seem to care, and doesn't seem to have the well-being of his people at his mind. And then again, we will hear from Africa, Edouard Elvis Vuma and Hermine Jolo from Cameroon will tell us what is happening there and how they experience this moment. It's different for everybody. And this is also gives us a little view inside the different ways that reality is playing out. It helps us, it consoles us, and hearing from you also feels us connected. We are not alone, and we do care for each other. And I think this is also the message that we hear from you, what you do for your community there. It is inspiring, it is significant, and of real importance. So thank you, and a reminder to everybody that yes, it's the theater and performance communities that are at the center of what a community life is, and what a functioning society is. If they go well, the society goes well, and now everything is closed down. We perhaps even understand it better and long for it much more. Thomas Ostermeyer said he misses so much the opening nights, the shadow, the energy, the people, the communities. And but as Ismail said, you know, it will come back. Nothing lasts forever. So let's prepare and use the time to live perhaps even better lives and make right what has been wrong before. So thank you all for listening. I know how much you all have on your mind, how many chats, how many family, how many calls, how many Zooms and Skypes, and but it means a lot that you all come and listen. We need great audiences, great listeners, and of course the work of our great artists. So stay safe and stay tuned, and I hope to see you tomorrow or hear you tomorrow. And thanks to the great HowlRound for supporting us, VJ and Thea, and to the Segal team. So thank you, and Ismail, I hope you will have a good dinner in Johannesburg, and really thank you for sharing. Goodbye.
Thank you.